Welcome everyone to this episode of The Next Page, the podcast of Library Archives here in Geneva. We are going to explore today how to reimagine global governance for food security. Food security is an immense problem on our planet. Every year, literally hundreds of millions of people face hunger despite the world producing more than enough food to feed everyone. And this issue is there as a permanent problem for the advancement of humankind. We have invited today an important part of Kofi Annan Foundation, a commission that was created by the Kofi Annan Foundation to look into reimagining global governance for food security. And we have with us Amir Abdulla, key member of the Kofi Annan Foundation Commission on Food Security. Amir is one of the commissioners. We invited him to share with us the findings of an important report, the title of which is basically the title of our episode today, Reimagining Global Governance. We'll put in the notes to this episode where to find this report so you can also read it. So, among other things, Amir Abdulla is formerly the Deputy Executive Director of World Food Program, so he's got experience in that and also in the UN action to guarantee food security around the world. He's the former UN coordinator of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, an initiative that was present in the press, of course, in the context of the conflict in Ukraine. So, Amir Abdulla, thank you very much for joining us on The Next Page. It's an honor for me to be with you over this video link, and I would like to welcome you again. Thank you for your time and also ask you to introduce yourself to our audience so they know better who you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really grateful that we're getting an opportunity to create this podcast on this hugely important issue of food security and the global governance of food and nutrition around the world. Myself, been interested in this for a very long time, as you mentioned. My role as the Deputy Executive Director in WFP. Also, I was the UN coordinator for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Prior to joining the World Food Program, where I spent 31 years, I joined in 91 and retired in 2022 from the WFP before becoming the UN coordinator of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. But prior to joining WFP, I'd worked in my home country, Sudan, in the shipping and transport sector. And prior to that, I'm an engineer by education, but so had worked in an electrical engineering company building power stations. But really, most of my working life in Sudan before joining WFP was in the shipping and transport sector. And much of what we shipped and transported, and WFP, UNHCR, UNICEF were our clients. I worked first in what was then Southern Sudan, of course today is South Sudan. I lived in Juba for several years, so transporting there, and then in Port Sudan, working mainly on the shipping side. But so much of what we moved was foodstuffs, primarily humanitarian relief food, but also agricultural commodities. So we were responsible for importing lots of fertilizer into Sudan and things like that. So I have been, involved in this sector for a long time, and have always been interested in how better coordination was needed. I could see so many initiatives and different things happening, but I got the sense that we would just kept repeating what we'd been doing in the past and felt that there had to be a better future. So when the opportunity came to join the commission, I was invited and asked if would I be interested to be part of this commission. I thought that here's an opportunity to really have a deep dive look at where we've come from, what we're doing, and where we might go. So I think that for me, this was a great opportunity, and I'm really glad I've got this opportunity to talk about it.
And indeed, we will have another deep dive today, because the objective of this episode is to bring to our audience really the contents and findings of this report. But before we get there, let's build some context for our audience to be at ease when we get to the deep dive. So I would like you, please, to introduce maybe the commission itself, created by the Kofi Annan Foundation. This is something that was created recently to look into the issue. And so let's talk about how the commission came about and the report itself overall, and then we'll go into the deep dive.
Well, the commission itself, in a nutshell, it was established to try and provide some policy recommendations for reimagining global governance on the architecture of food and nutrition, but very much also, and that's this podcast is a huge opportunity for that, to raise public awareness, mobilize political commitments around the findings and recommendations of the report. The Commission was born out of a deep realization that global governance for food and nutrition is failing to deliver. We're not getting to where we need to be. And as you said in the introduction, over 700 million people facing hunger. The report talks of 733 million people facing hunger. And that's possibly and probably an underestimation. There are probably over 800 million. And yet at the same time, as you mentioned, we produce enough nutritious food to feed 1.5 times the global population. So in other words, we've got enough food for the total global population and half as many again. And, the commission itself, we were 7 individuals, all of us, very varied backgrounds. I hope that people who listen to this will get the interest. They can go online and look at the commission, and there's a lot said there about each of the individual commissioners, so I won't go into that. But there were 7 of us with very varied backgrounds, with different interests, but having a common theme. We're very engaged on this issue of food and nutrition security. And we felt that when we came together, we weren't there looking to pinpoint faults on individuals, but rather we looked at this from a system perspective, a systemic issue with really entrenched structural dividers. We're doing this also now, and the report has come out at a time when the multilateral system is really being called into question. What, is the benefit and value in the multilateral system itself, which I truly believe there is. But the Commission report provides what I believe is a healthy mirror for the system to look at itself, to find out how it can reinforce and improve itself, and really make sure that we have a system that works for people, the people of the planet, and those, especially those who find themselves through no fault of their own in food insecurity.
And there is something that I was both impressed and convinced in the report when it says very starkly, and I'm quoting, "The problem is a global food governance system that is outdated and failing to meet today's challenges." So can you elaborate on this? And maybe the question that I had was, naively, why now? But you just brought it up, the pressure under which multilateralism as a system is today. But there is this, stark finding by the report just up there, up front. The system is outdated and failing to meet today's challenges.
Yeah, I think that's really important, why again? And I think it's also important to remind ourselves this is not the first of its kind review of global governance of the architecture of food security. There have been, several. More recently, the Committee on World Food Security, they went through a full review and reform in 2009. The Food System Summit series that have been going, all of these have had, quite strong looks, and the Commission report builds on all of those. It goes back and looks at all of these, but it asks itself fundamentally, the number of hungry people is increasing. Malnutrition on both sectors, where we have, people who have not having enough to eat and or not enough nutritious food, and we have wasting and stunting of children. But on the other hand, we also see obesity on the rise. So there is a nutrition deficiency and macronutrient deficiencies more persistent, and the systems that we have are antiquated. They are not designed to respond quickly to the growing challenges, and as a result of the growing challenge, the increasing and resulting needs. So really, in the face of these very worrying challenges, we're seeing that, the commitments were made on the SDGs with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. We're not getting there. And yet we're also now, as you just mentioned, at a pivotal time. This is a pivot point in international relations. We could I don't think it's an exaggeration that we're now living through a new world order. And we have to look at this new world order and decide, are we going to recenter and focus on important agenda items like the SDG 2 and zero hunger, or are we going to fail? Are we going to let this fall through the cracks and disappear in the current noise that is emanating around this whole thing? So I think it's a hugely important point in time. So, and of course, as we worked through the report and everything, we knew that the world was going through these changes, but I don't think we realized at the time just how important it was going to be when the report came out for people to take this, look at what we have as a new world order, and then work, how can we improve what we have? So there is so much good going on, but it's not necessarily reinforcing and coming together in a more coordinated and efficient manner. And that's what I hope the report will help to strengthen and provide for.
And so let's share with the audience now more about the findings of the report. So let's start the deep dive, if you will, so that they can really see through the report almost as if they had read it. So I noticed that the Commission identified in the report 4 global governance shifts and 10 actionable recommendations. So, can you walk us through these?
Certainly, and I think that is that is the best way to describe it. The way the report is set out, and I think I also hope that people who get interested in this will take the time. The report's very easy to find, and you really would need to go and look at it and read to get perhaps even more than I'm going to be able to do on a podcast. But let's focus. The way the report was set out is that it decided we would focus on if we were talking about improving the governance of food, and where did governance need to shift? Where did we need to change? And we identified 4 areas of where we felt we could really get a change in how the governance of today is set about. And each of the governance shifts were, they were looked at them, the points made there, help to pivot, to change the narrative to a place where we can make sure we get buy-in, especially political, because without the buy-in and especially political buy-in, you can't make progress. And then also they're designed and set out to challenge the system where it needs to be challenged so that we can get more resilient, innovative, and equitable models come out of that. And those governance shifts are then designed in a way that the recommendations that are made, and I will talk about the recommendations, divided, and there are a few recommendations under each of these governance shifts. So the first governance shift, which of course, while talking about hunger and food insecurity, you immediately brought to SDG 2 of Agenda 2030. We're not getting there though. So the first real governance shift says we need to reorient action on Agenda 2030. Now, this became even more important perhaps than the time we wrote, because in the past weeks, the very notion of Agenda 2030 is being brought into question. So its principles and foundations, they're being torn apart. The relevance is being scrutinized. So the recommendations under this shift, I believe, are central. And the first recommendation is about accountability, which says we need better governance, meaning that multilateral agencies responsible for food and nutrition interventions need to do better. And the report makes a bold recommendation calling for the establishment of a food governance group. And this group gives the possibility to enlarge the scope of actors. So it moves it away from what I would refer to as the Rome triangle of IFAD, FAO, and WFP, but it would include other actors such as UNICEF, but also others. And in there is a lot more detail of what this food governance group would do within the report, but it basically would almost be a merging of the different boards or governing bodies of these, not merging them, but finding a formal way in which they could put together coordinated recommendations. The second thing of reorienting the second recommendation under the action on Agenda 2030 is about data and the governance of data, and how can we accelerate a push for zero hunger. And to do so really requires improved tools for measuring and for more effective governance of the resulting data. It's no point we need better tools to measure and get the data, but then you need to have better governance from the resulting data that informs and enables actors to make bold and decisive decisions. And in this, you could also see, the most vulnerable are not heard until they're seen. And we need to find a way to show and bring to the fore the most vulnerable people suffering from the food security. And, unfortunately, just recently also, the funding has been challenged on a group called FuseNet, which is the early warning system designed to alert on famine. So, there are challenges going, on the data. So we need to make sure that these two key action points on coherent governance of the bodies and coherence of how the data is measured and then used needs to really, I believe, be really strongly looked at if we're going to get to where we need to on Agenda 2030. The second governance shift talks about prevention, and it's titled Delivering on Prevention. And here, really it points to a failure of the global system has on addressing the underlying drivers of food and nutrition insecurity. Or we often are reacting to the symptoms rather than dealing with the causes too often. And early preventive action is, and we know, there are many, many studies on this that show this is a much more cost-effective strategy. Yet the multilateral system, often because of the way it is funded, and I'll talk about financing as one of the other recommendations, but the multilateral system frequently has delays in the comprehensive reaction that would prevent the slide into hunger. And under this governance shift, there are two key recommendations, and one is building peace for food security. And there are several ideas put under this. One of them includes establishing a special rapporteur for food and peace. And this would need to be properly resourced and given the mandate, and just otherwise it would just be a nice to have. And here we note that the issue of conflict and food insecurity so intertwined. We do have often the tools. There is the Security Council Resolution 2417, which is very clear on the issue of the weaponizing of food in conflict. But we believe the Commission felt that, notwithstanding that tool that is already there, we don't have the mechanisms to address it. The other key recommendation on the delivering on prevention is about anticipation and breaking away from the cyclical crisis response mode. Crisis, respond, then you just, if things are better for a while, then you have another crisis, and just you keep on going in this vicious cycle almost. So to prevent the slide into hunger, the Commission report talks about the need for robust social protection mechanisms. And here one of the recommendations talks about setting up a food security protection mechanism. And this would be almost like an insurance tool, and this would provide an international framework for a new early response capacity to cover, there is the IPC, which is the international phase classification that talks about the different levels of food insecurity. And there is the category 2, which is what known as stress. This is before people get into really food insecure, or the worst is IPC 5 in famine. But to stop them falling into 3, 4, and 5, if we get into this level 2 where the stresses start, and providing proper social protection mechanisms and using the ones that we have today, such as the mother and child nutrition mechanisms, the use of school meals programs. There are many different ways in which this is done. The details are there in the report, but it really talks about using these as to deliver on prevention, to stop the slide. The third governance shift is recognizing and seeing food as a global public good. In other words, saying that food cannot just be treated merely as a traded commodity. So we need to elevate the whole issue of food system sustainability as a global responsibility. Now, to do this, interventions on food can't be detached from those in the climate agenda, global trade agenda, and this is, they're so intertwined, these issues of, food security and climate, but food security and trade. And we need to find a way to make this about being a global public good. And the other, in addition to obviously climate and trade, is the international financing. And we need to have an international financial architecture that is more equitable and fairer. And the report echoes and supports efforts that are actually ongoing to reform the global financial architecture. There was a very vocal point made recently by President Mia Mottley, and where, she has really been quite a strong voice and advocate on this. And sovereign debt has kept low-income countries trapped. They have to make very hard fiscal choices, and food, at the end of the day, can't just become a choice. It has to be a public good. So we want to highlight existing legal mechanisms, with such as the right to food. There are many mechanisms, and the recommendations under this shift include those on bringing together the food systems and climate. So the governance and agenda mechanisms that we have under there should be better integrated. There is also a recommendation on the financing food systems that I've just mentioned, and then there are some calls for governments to cooperate to ensure that there is a more equitable food trade regime. And obviously there are, this would include relieving pressure on WTO negotiations on tariffs and non-tariffs. And of course, tariffs are very much in the news these days. So I think the recommendations there, I hope that people go and have a read at them and recognize or look to see how, different people can become a voice for dealing with the stresses that we're all facing. There are 4 governance shifts that spoken about, 3 of them. The fourth one really is about shaping the future. This is, can we managing future food and nutrition needs through anticipatory processes and approaches, and what can we do to make the future better? So we know that the future of global food security will be defined and challenged by, there's a persistent multi-dimensional crises, and anticipating those challenges using technological innovation will help to reduce pressure on the food supply. And technology really can become an opportunity, and it can offer solutions. But it's not just about the technology. We need to include young people and really make sure that women and girls are at the forefront of these food and nutrition transitions. And, they often, if you look at gender desegregated data, they are often the ones who are suffering the most, but they're actually the ones, women and girls are perhaps hold the key for us to get to a better position. And of course, you can't look at the future or plan the context of food and nutrition without really talking and thinking about the role of smallholder farmers. The smallholder farmers, they produce nearly 80% of our food. And so their role, it's incredible. It's central, yet they often end up being among the most food poor on our planet. So how did we get to a position like that? And we need to look and find, how do we get there, and how do we move to a better place? And farmers, they need support in adopting sustainable agricultural practices, but they themselves are the custodian of knowledge related to land, food waste, and much more. They are the central players. So we have to recognize that these planetary transformations are inevitable. Things will change, but human threats to our natural systems and our societies are progressively rising, and they're rising with devastating consequences. And if we look at what has happened over the recent decades, so now is not a time to recede, to go back on this. So, the multilateral system may feel that it's on its knees, but we need a reimagined global system. We need to look at this. So, this report is coming at a time when people are looking for counter narratives. And I think all of these four agenda, whether it's and on action on Agenda 2030, whether it's delivering a better prevention thing, whether it's recognizing food as a global public good, whether it's about shaping the future, they are coming out at a time when this is really, really needed. And when I look at my own role in this, having spent over 30 years with the World Food Programme, some time on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, where I really saw how conflict affects the food crisis and pushing food prices and fuel prices. And you push fuel prices up, you impact food prices. That my time before that incident, I've spent my whole, I would say, working life on this, and I recognize how much I would say my time on this has come and gone. But I'm a grandfather. I have 3 grandchildren, and what is the world that is being left for them to grow up in? And I'm hoping that this report will be picked up on and that we will get to a better place.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us and the audience through the shifts and the recommendations. I really invite the audience to go to the notes of this podcast, click on them, and then I have read the report. It's really readable. It's not, I don't want the audience to imagine some, very complicated UN-style report. Is not the case. This report is down to the ground. It's very straightforward, very understandable. Actually, I've learned a lot about food insecurity and food security, and I really appreciate it. And I wanted to come back to this with you. This kind of view, the report really captured the context of this immense shift that is happening in international relations, in the way we perceive what international relation is here to do, and the place and responsibilities of actors that interact in this system that we call international relations. And these responsibilities are also shifting as we face challenges that have become global, and you cannot walk around them. You have to go through them and face up to them. So the thing that I appreciate the most about this report is that it faces up to the challenge of what is food insecurity and what it risks to become in the future. Now, there is something you said in the last part of your explanation that really offered me a segue to something I was curious about. Every time I interact with the Kofi Annan Foundation, every time I read materials emanating from the foundation, I can see this special focus on youth and what's to come. So these are the two things I wanted to touch upon with you before we part and we wrap up the episode. So youth and what's next. Let's start with youth. How has youth manifested as a concern, as a potential, as an actor, as a voice in the work of the Commission, and where is it traceable in the report, if anywhere?
I mean, you're right. The Kofi Annan Foundation does have a really special focus on youth, and they have great contacts and great access to getting to youth activists around the globe. So the Kofi Annan Foundation, they actually ran a specific youth working group looking at food insecurity. So they ran their own working group in parallel with the Commission's work. They were fed the material that the Commission were looking at, and they ran online surveys, focus group interviews, and everything. And then we brought key leaders from that youth working group, met with some of the commissioners. I was very lucky to be one of them. There were 3 of the commissioners, met with the group to hear their findings and have discussions with them. And I really benefited from the really rich insights that these young experts shared during that session with myself and some fellow commissioners. They had some amazing viewpoints, but also some amazing ideas. And we took what the youth said back to the commission, went over some of the grounds that we had already done, and particularly on the governance shift for the shaping the future. The recommendations there were all more or less rewritten, refocused to take into account. They were reshaped, I would say, by what the youth working group had come up with. So I think, they gave thoughts and ideas on all of it, but the area that I would say that they had most input on was under governance shift 4, which is a very appropriate place, I think, for youth when we're talking about the future.
Thank you for that. And now let's, before we conclude, talk about what's next on several planes. What next for the report? What is going? Where do you think it will have an impact? But also what next in terms of this harrowing issue of food insecurity? You've got 30 years experience in this, so you have an enormous overview. You have this capacity to maybe project the life of this problem that we call food insecurity into the future. So I'm asking Amir Abdulla, the professional, the man who's invested his professional life in this. What's next?
Well, I mean, that, of course, is the $1 billion question. I think for the report, what next for the report? Well, I was fortunate. I was in Rome with a few of the other commissioners, with the team that launched the report in Rome, which was, it was launched in Geneva and in Rome. First in Geneva, then in Rome, and I attended the launch in Rome, and I really saw firsthand the response that the report already started receiving from member states. In other words, these were the member states who from the governing bodies of the Rome-based agencies. But I felt that they were very engaged, that there was room for further discussions. And, even in these distressing times that we service. Also, the actual work of the commission comes to an end the end of March. The funding that had been provided very generously by the Rockefeller Foundation, it basically takes us through till the end of March. But that is not where the report needs, it can't be, we don't want this to be a report that just sits on a shelf. And thank you very much for your point. It is actually very readable. It's a very easy to read and easy to digest report. And it's also very easy to read online. You often find that, sometimes reports are not easy to, if you get hold of a hard copy, it's very easy to read that too. But it is not dense, I know it's certainly not a boring report. It's not dense, but we don't want it to be a report to just go and sit on a shelf. So one of the ways we're trying to make sure the time that we have left is to mobilize, get as much information out as we can, mobilize more support so that the work continues around the findings, the shifts that are needed, the recommendations that are there. So although the commission's activities would end, this report, I believe, will live on, and then of course the Kofi Annan Foundation lives on. And, I would urge the listeners to this podcast to go to the website, pick up on the report. Because if I pick up on the other point that you just made, this is happening at a time in international relations, to use that term, of which I would say, it's probably an often overused statement that, this is unprecedented times. I mean, I think, we perhaps have overused that in the past, but this time, I think we are definitely at liberty to use that term. But then we must not lose heart. We must not lose, there is so much goodwill. And I think as we find ourselves stressed in one area, the saying that, when one door closes, a window opens. So we have to look for those openings, those opportunities. And I think that the report points out that that this ends up being a responsibility of all of us primarily, in a lot of it is going to be a responsibility of governments, and they need to look to how they can, governments need to look after their own people. And I think, but as individuals, we where we have the opportunity to be activists, to be promoters, to put pressure on those who are our elected officials, where we have that, where not everybody has that opportunity, but where we have that opportunity, let us use it. And I think it is something that we need to almost, it's a crime and a sin and a moral issue when we talk about, that there is enough food on the planet to more than feed ourselves. We can feed ourselves and the 50% left over. We shouldn't be having the issues of food insecurity that we do. And we often, when we think of food insecurity, we think of those conflict-ridden areas, and a lot of it happens in conflict areas, and we need to find a way, which is why we have this very specific recommendation on peace and food security. But that's not, it's not just in conflict zones where we have this, I would say, almost moralish or moral crime of food and nutrition insecurity. So we need everyone, in a sense, to become an activist.
And that could sound like a final thought to wrap up this episode, but I will ask you anyway. I'm also interested in hearing from you what is that you want to impress upon our audience as a final thought, both as a professional, long-time professional in food security, and also as a member of this commission at this critical time. What is your final thought?
I think if I was to think of final thoughts, I would say that we have a huge challenge ahead of us, but it's not insurmountable. I think, it's often, I think the report itself, I think, opens with that quote from Kofi Annan, who mentioned that, we had enough resources to solve hunger, we just need the will. So, my final thought would be that, or what would I want to see, is that everyone becomes an activist, that we recognize that this is an issue that can be dealt with. We need to find a way to ensure that the will is there. I think after 30 odd years in that, to see the one thing, you could go away, just disheartened and something, but I don't. I actually believe that there is enough evidence. So what I would hope is that some of the listeners to this podcast will then go and have even deeper dive into this report and look thing. And I would also say that, what I would like, we would commit this report to people who are going to, if you're going to be working on food security or the governance of food security, that you sort of almost take this as an instruction manual about how you can get things done better. Because as the report points out, we don't claim to be the starting point. There has been so much done before, but what it is, I believe, is a tremendous summary of all the different initiatives that are ongoing to try and bring them together better so that they can move forward in a coordinated manner. So I would say, as a commissioner, the commission's coming to an end, as stepping down as a commission, my professional view as a commissioner is that I hope that we have put out a report that will not just be read or left somewhere to gather dust, but people will actually keep it carried around with them as an instruction manual on how we can reimagine global governance and actually get to a better world, which is certainly my hope for all, particularly as it is a world in which my grandchildren will grow up.
Thank you so much, Amir Abdulla, member of the Kofi Annan Foundation Commission on Food Security, one of the writers of this report, Reimagining Global Governance. Thank you for taking the time to be on the next page together with us today.
Thank you very much, Francesco. It was a pleasure.